Climate change has been in the news for decades. There are reports almost weekly on how the temperature of the Earth is increasing, ocean levels are rising, and ice sheets in the Arctic and Antarctic are melting. Yet some people, in fact a lot of people, still either don't believe it or are not very worried about the future of the planet. Why is this? Per Espen Stoknes wondered that too. He's a psychologist and an economist who has studied the phenomenon of climate change and the public's thoughts about it. He wrote about his findings in his book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, Towards a New Psychology of Climate Action. Stoknes says that the message about climate change and our reactions to it seem out of kilter, a situation he calls the climate paradox.
Over the previous decades, we've seen a large growth in scientific certainty of how serious this issue is and that it's human caused. So we had like 5 IPCC reports and 30,000 scientific articles. But people, at least in Norway and the US, are less concerned about climate change today than they were 25 years ago, back in 1989. So you would believe that as we get more facts, more information, and more knowledge about this issue, that people would recognize how critical it is. But the opposite seems to be the reality. And that's what we call the psychological climate paradox.
Stoknes has condensed the reasons for this paradox down to 5 main defenses, the 5 Ds our brains use to convince us that global warming isn't as dire as the facts indicate. The first defense is distance.
The climate seems to be distant in time. We talk about the year 2100. Climate scientists are talking about the next centuries and decades. And also the imagery that has been used, such as polar bears or Arctic ice or cyclones in the Pacific or drowning people in Pakistan or Bangladesh, they always seem to be very distant in space from where we live. And then the people that suffer from this are often poorer or socially distant as well. And finally, the people who are responsible for doing something with this are national politicians or international negotiators. We hear news from these climate negotiations, but it's outside my scope of influence. So it doesn't seem that whatever I do, it will have any influence anyway.
The news about the future is sometimes so scary and apocalyptic. Manhattan will be flooded from the ocean rising, extreme droughts will scorch the earth, that our brains don't want to think about the consequences. So we put them out of our heads. That's the second D, doom.
This type of framing, as psychologists call it, that generates a want to avoid the issue. So we develop what is called avoidance behaviors. We learn to shut our ears and not think much about it, because otherwise we will feel maybe fear or guilt. And these feelings are not conducive to becoming engaged in a sustainable way. What psychology has demonstrated is that fear and guilt is deeply pacifying. We choose to look another way rather than actually engaging with it if we have too much doom. So sometimes I call this apocalypse fatigue.
The third D is dissonance. It deals with our knowledge that we need to do something to stop global warming, but we just can't bring ourselves to change.
On the one hand, we know what we should do. On the other hand, we have a lifestyle that was built. And together, this creates a conflict or what some psychologists would call the dissonance between what we do and how we live. So I care about the earth, I care about society, and still I live a life where I destroy it. And this feeling is kind of uncomfortable. In order to get rid of this dissonance, we people are pretty good at coming up with self-justifications for how we live. I can, for instance, say, well, it's not my emissions, it's theirs. It's the Chinese, or it's the Middle East, or it's the Indians now coming up, or I can point to somewhere else.
That fear and guilt we feel is mitigated by denial, the fourth D. And we try to resist anyone criticizing our lifestyle or identity, the fifth D. So, how do we frame the issue of climate change so that it'll become an integral part of our lives, so that we can address the problems and keep peace with our brain's need to make us feel safe, secure, and comfortable? Stoknes says that we can begin by framing the issue of global warming the way we did the depletion of the ozone layer back in the 1970s.
The ozone layer came with the framing of really being about health here and now, in the sense that if we didn't do that, I would get skin cancer, right? And this is not necessarily just doom, but it's health framing, because if you look at what people actually give a high political priority, what's called the issue importance. And then when they rate these, they typically give economy, health, education, jobs. Those are among the top 4 political concerns. And climate change, if it's listed as such, becomes like 19 out of 20. But what we can do to avoid that distancing that we've been talking about is that if we frame the climate as a health issue in the same way as the ozone layer was framed as a health issue, then it suddenly gets much higher up on people's priority list.
Stokeness says we also need to use the power of social networks to get people feeling comfortable about changing their lifestyles and work habits. He says we've tried for decades to pile facts and figures on people without much success. But if we can see that others in our social circle, our peers, are taking action, we're more likely to do it ourselves.
If you have a neighborhood where one house suddenly gets solar panels on the roof, then the likelihood of the houses just nearby also getting solar panels goes way up. So actually solar panels in a neighborhood seem to be contagious. A much higher likelihood than somewhere else.
Creating neighborhood or citywide activities that are fun and get the message across is also a good way to encourage action among residents.
A part of the city of Bergen in Norway, they've started throwing climate parties in the neighborhood to really get people involved each time there's a sports event, or when spring comes and the bikes get out, or in the autumn when there's harvesting. They have this from protest to party metaphor, because that makes it much more enjoyable and fun to do something together rather than just sitting behind the television screen by yourself and being depressed by the climate news.
Having fun and interacting with your neighbors to address climate change can make it a little more palatable, but there's still that doom scenario hanging over our heads. Stokeness says we already prepare for disasters in our everyday lives by buying insurance. So why not extend that to climate change?
We don't really think that our house will burn down, yet we do have a fire insurance. We pay for that each year. So we've learned to handle risk. We have risk management, but we don't do that in terms of climate. So we know that the Earth may, so to speak, burn down, but we don't invest anything or put any money into a climate insurance. This has been promoted quite effective in the U.S. through a report authored by a Republican and a Democrat, Andy Paulson and Bloomberg, called Risky Business. They now say it's time to take out a climate insurance of our own. That's just plain good business sense.
There are also many economic opportunities that present themselves with climate change, and Stokeness says it's a great incentive to get business on the climate bandwagon instead of looking for ways to maintain the status quo. Solar and wind power could be expanded, and we could build smart homes that were energy efficient, instead of continuing to use large amounts of fossil fuels for heating and electricity. There's also a way that we could power our cars, not with gasoline, but with solar energy created by the very roads we drive on.
The climate change signals a shift in our energy system that will create endless opportunities for doing things much smarter. Like, we had a lot of cheap oil in the 20th century, but we don't have that much cheap oil anymore. So using solar panels, wind, making smart homes. We have smartphones. We could even make smart roads. One example of this opportunity frame is the startup called Solar Roadways. It's a new technology that would replace the asphalt with solar panels you can drive on. And they would generate the power that the cars would need. And you could also put some lighting on them so they would have smart signals. They could signal if there's somebody crossing in the dark, or they could even expand the place available for biking if there's a lot of bikes, etc. So we'd have smart roads that would give us a much better livelihood and be net energy positive. So people really like this idea, and they put a lot of money into it. So it was the highest crowdsourced initiative on Indiegogo last year.
Reporting about the ways we fool ourselves into doing nothing about climate change and coming up with strategies for reframing the conversation are all well and good. But what are the chances that we'll do anything toward finally dealing with the problem?
I actually think that this decade are going to be the turning point in our cultures. So I call it the breakthrough decade, along with a thinker called John Elkington. You see it started already today. Actually, the year 2014 was the first time in history when CO2 emissions did not increase, yet we grew our economy. And in the first quarter of 2015, China actually reduced their coal consumption more than 10%. And this is early signs along with smart investors now moving their money out of fossils and into renewables and more resource efficient, that we will have, you could call it, the resource revolution.
Stokeness says that the media need to do their part in all of this as well, and they can begin by reframing their own reports on climate change from doom and gloom to the positive things that can be and are being done to address the issue. He's optimistic that we can handle global climate change and foresees a time when we'll look back at our use of fossil fuels as rather old-fashioned.
The solution to the climate problem is the greatest story that was never told. And I like the metaphor, from thinking about the Stone Age. The Stone Age way back didn't end because of a lack of stones. It ended because people found smarter way of doing things. And petroleum, or the petro in petroleum means actually stones. So the petroleum age won't end because of a lack of oil, but because we find much smarter way of achieving what we want, which is mobility, light, entertainment, temperature that we want to have, and food that doesn't rely on an excessive, wasteful use of oil. I think very soon oil and petroleum will have an image of being just so 20th century.
You can read the research and learn about strategies for dealing with climate change in the public and private spheres and in our own heads in Per Espen Stoknes's book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, available now in stores and online. He also invites listeners to visit his website at stoknes.com. For information about all of our guests, you can log on to our site at viewpointsonline.net. You can also find archives of past programs there and on iTunes and Stitcher. I'm Gary Price.
Back to school season is always busy, so the quality time families spend gathering around the dinner table is extra important. Chef Kevin Vetter of the McCormick Kitchens joins us to share tips about making easy and flavorsome homemade dinners you'll feel good about serving.
It can be tempting to order takeout or turn to a ready-made meal when you need to get dinner on the table in a pinch. Instead, make a simple, wholesome one-pot meal for easy prep and cleanup. For a quick twist on taco night, make a quinoa dish. Brown ground turkey in the skillet, and stir in cooked quinoa, chopped tomatoes, and corn. Season with McCormick Organics Taco Seasoning Mix, sprinkle with cheese, and you've got a kid-friendly dinner that's ready in 30 minutes. Spaghetti squash is another ingredient families can feel good about that's readily available this season. Cut it into rings and cook it in the microwave to save on time. Then toss it in a skillet with some shrimp, garlic, ginger, and soy sauce for a quick veggie take on shrimp lo mein.
For more recipes and tips, visit McCormick.com or find McCormick Spice on Facebook and Pinterest.
Milk's nutrition, including high-quality protein, helps get kids ready to learn, but unfortunately, millions of children and families don't have regular access to it. September is Feeding America's Hunger Action Month, and as kids head back to school, the Great American Milk Drive is encouraging Americans to donate with purpose by providing nutrient-rich milk to children and their families. More than 46 million Americans, including 12 million children, are served by Feeding America Network food banks each year. Milk is one of the most requested yet least donated items at food banks. That means that children in need in your community may be missing out on milk's 9 essential nutrients, including 8 grams of high-quality protein in each serving. With a small donation, you can make a big difference for a local family. Donate at milklife.com/give or at any of the more than 3,800 participating grocery and convenience store locations across the country to feed a childhood and help to ensure that all children have the potential to learn, grow, and play. Visit milklife.com/give. That's milklife.com/give.